Before we begin, let me tell you about a nation that tore itself apart. A country so divided that fathers disowned sons, brothers aimed rifles at brothers, and nearly 4 million people lived in chains. This is not ancient history. This is America. 1861. A nation standing at the edge of an abyss, about to plunge into the deadliest war it would ever fight. Over 600,000 soldiers would die, more than all other American wars combined. Entire towns would vanish, families would be destroyed, and the question of what America truly meant would be answered in blood. This is the story of the American Civil War. A conflict so brutal, so devastating, that it would reshape the soul of a nation, from the first cannon shot that lit the Charleston sky to the final surrender in a quiet Virginia farmhouse. This is the story of how America died and was reborn. The causes ran deep, deeper than most understood. The battles were larger than anyone imagined. The leaders were flawed, brilliant, tragic, and human, and the cost was beyond measure. What you are about to hear is not just history. It is the story of America's darkest hour, told through 40 pivotal moments that defined a nation. Each moment a turning point, each decision a matter of life and death, each battle a step closer to either salvation or destruction. This is the American Civil War. And it begins with a single shot in the darkness. A single cannon shot lit the sky and ended peace forever. 4:30 in the morning, April 12, 1861, Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The water was still. The air was thick with tension. 4 months, the nation had been unraveling, southern states seceding one by one. Northern politicians desperately trying to hold the Union together, and in the middle of it all stood Fort Sumter, a small brick fortress occupied by 85 Union soldiers, surrounded by 6,000 Confederate troops, their cannons aimed, their orders clear. The Confederate government had demanded surrender. Major Robert Anderson, the Union commander, had refused. And so, at 4:30 in the morning, a mortar fired from Fort Johnson arced over Charleston Harbor, exploding above Fort Sumter. That single burst of light announced the beginning of the American Civil War and shattered decades of tension between North and South. The flash illuminated more than the harbor that morning. It revealed a nation divided, a people unable to reconcile their differences, and a future about to be written in blood. For 30 years, America had been arguing. Compromises had been made, lines had been drawn. Politicians had warned that the nation could not survive half slave and half free, but no one had listened. No one had truly believed it would come to this. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, each one a desperate attempt to postpone the inevitable, each one making the divide deeper, wider, more unbridgeable. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860, a man who opposed the expansion of slavery, was the final straw. South Carolina seceded in December. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. By February 1861, they had formed the Confederate States of America. Lincoln had stood on the steps of the Capitol in March, sworn to preserve the Union, and promised he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. But his words meant nothing to the South. They saw his election as a threat. They saw the growing power of the North as an existential danger. And they chose independence over compromise. Fort Sumter became the flashpoint, a Union garrison on Confederate soil, a symbol of Northern authority in Southern waters. The Confederacy could not allow it to remain. Anderson could not surrender without orders, and so the cannon fired. For 34 hours, Confederate artillery bombarded the fort. Over 3,000 shells rained down. The fort's walls crumbled. Fires raged through the barracks. Anderson's men fought back with their limited guns, but they were hopelessly outmatched. And on the rooftops of Charleston, something extraordinary happened. Civilian spectators climbed rooftops to watch the first battle unfold. As Confederate guns thundered across Charleston Harbor, residents gathered on balconies, climbed church towers, stood on rooftops with opera glasses. Some brought picnic baskets. Ladies wore their finest dresses. Gentlemen smoked cigars and toasted Southern independence. They believed they were witnessing a spectacle, a show of Southern power, a glorious moment in their new nation's history. They watched the fort burn, its defenders fighting desperately with limited men and scarce ammunition. Some cheered with each explosion. Some gasped at particularly close hits. None understood that they were watching the beginning of America's bloodiest war, a conflict that would consume over 600,000 lives. Smoke rose over the water. Shells exploded against brick walls. The Confederate flag snapped in the wind, and the crowd watched, mesmerized, unaware that war is never a spectacle, only a tragedy. They could not know that 4 years later, Charleston would be in ruins, its economy destroyed, its young men dead, its world changed forever. They could not know that this moment of celebration was the beginning of their own destruction. Inside the fort, Major Anderson and his men fought with everything they had, but it was hopeless. The fort was on fire. Their ammunition was running low, and no help was coming. Then, in a moment that seemed to freeze time itself, something happened. The Union flag fell, and with it, the last hope of avoiding war. A Confederate shell snapped Fort Sumter's flagpole, and the stars and stripes tumbled into the smoke and debris. For a moment, everything stopped. Confederate gunners paused. Union soldiers stared. The crowd in Charleston fell silent. It was more than a flag falling. It was the collapse of compromise, the death of peaceful resolution, the end of the old America. Major Anderson watched it fall, knowing what it meant. After 34 hours of bombardment, after fires raged through the fort, after his men had given everything they had, he knew it was over. He asked for terms. The Confederates offered generous surrender. Anderson and his men could leave with honor, take their personal belongings, even fire a salute to their flag before departing. On April 14th, Anderson's garrison evacuated Fort Sumter. The Confederate flag rose over the fort, and the South celebrated. They had won. They had proven their military might. They had forced the Union to back down. But they had also unleashed something they could not control. The flag would rise again, over Fort Sumter, over Charleston, over the entire South, but not before hundreds of thousands had died to raise it. When news of Fort Sumter reached Washington, President Lincoln faced a choice: accept Southern independence, or fight to preserve the Union. There was no middle ground, no more compromises, no more delays. His response came swiftly. Lincoln's response was swift, and it changed everything. President Abraham Lincoln did not hesitate. On April 15th, the day after Fort Sumter surrender, he issued a proclamation. He called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress what he labeled not a legitimate government, but a rebellion, an insurrection, an illegal uprising that had to be crushed. His proclamation echoed across the nation, and it forced a choice. Every state, every citizen, had to decide, Union or Confederacy. There was no middle ground anymore, no neutrality, no waiting to see how things would develop. Lincoln's call for troops pushed Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina into the Confederacy. These states had hesitated, hoping for peace, trying to remain neutral, but Lincoln's demand that they provide troops to invade their southern neighbors, that was a line they would not cross. By late May, 11 states had seceded. The Confederacy stretched from Virginia to Texas, from the Atlantic to the frontier. nearly 9 million people, including over 3.5 million enslaved. The border states trembled: Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware. They remained in the Union, but their loyalties were divided, families divided, brothers prepared to fight brothers, fathers disowned sons who enlisted in the opposing army. In Kentucky, Senator John Crittenden had two sons. One became a general in the Union Army, the other became a general in the Confederate Army. Lincoln had drawn the line, and America had crossed it. The war was no longer coming, it had arrived. And the South, confident in its righteousness and its military prowess, answered Lincoln's call with one of its own. The South answered Lincoln with a call for 100,000 men of their own. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, mobilized his new nation, a former U.S. Senator, a West Point graduate, a Mexican war hero. Davis believed deeply in the Confederate cause, in states' rights, in the Southern way of life. He knew the Confederacy was outnumbered. The Union had 22 million people. The Confederacy had 9 million, and over a third of those were enslaved and could not be armed. The North had factories, railroads, shipyards. The South was agricultural, dependent on cotton exports, vulnerable to blockade. But Davis believed in Southern courage, Southern honor, and the righteousness of their cause. He believed that one Southern man was worth 10 Yankees, that fighting on their own soil gave them an advantage, that the North would not have the will to fight a long war. Davis called for 100,000 men, hoping to gather enough manpower to fight a war he knew would test the South to its breaking point. From Virginia to Texas, men enlisted. They came from plantations and small farms, from towns and cities, rich men and poor, slaveholders and non-slaveholders. They came believing they were defending their homes, their rights, their freedom from northern tyranny. Both sides believed the conflict would be short, that one great battle would decide everything, that by Christmas, the war would be over. Both were tragically wrong. The war would drag on for 4 years, consuming towns, cities, entire generations. Neither Lincoln nor Davis could have imagined the scale of destruction that was coming. Neither could have foreseen the technological horror of modern war, the rifled muskets that could kill at 500 yards, the artillery that could tear a man in half, the diseases that would kill twice as many as the bullets. As the armies assembled, as volunteers drilled in fields and town squares, as mothers kissed sons goodbye and wives embraced husbands for the last time, the magnitude of what was coming remained hidden. But there were warnings. Lincoln's cabinet doubted him, and his generals doubted themselves. The Union High Command was elderly, cautious, and divided. General Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the U.S. Army, was 75 years old, a hero of the Mexican War, a brilliant strategist in his time, but now too old to ride a horse, too old to take the field. Lincoln inherited an army that existed mostly on paper. Before Fort Sumter, the U.S. Army numbered only 16,000 men. Most were scattered in frontier forts, fighting Indians, far from the coming war. The officer corps was split. Nearly a third of U.S. Army officers resigned to join the Confederacy, including some of the most talented commanders: Robert E. Lee, Joseph Johnston, Albert Sidney Johnston, P.G.T. Beauregard. These men had trained together at West Point, fought together in Mexico, and now would face each other as enemies. Lincoln struggled to find leaders capable of directing a modern war. His generals bickered, hesitated, second-guessed. They worried about political consequences, about public opinion, about their own reputations. General Irvin McDowell, given command of the Union Army assembling near Washington, protested that his men were not ready. "You are green, it is true," Lincoln told him, "but they are green also. You are all green alike." Meanwhile, The Confederates were led by aggressive commanders who exploited Northern inexperience: Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, J.E.B. Stuart. These men were bold, decisive, dangerous. They understood that the Confederacy could not win a long war. They had to strike hard, strike fast, and break the Unions well before Northern resources overwhelmed them. Lincoln watched his generals fumble, watched opportunities slip away, and wondered if the Union could survive long enough to find the leadership it desperately needed. The clock was ticking, and the South was winning the political battle. General Scott, too old to lead armies in the field, proposed a different kind of strategy. The Union attempted a bold plan to end the war before it spread. General Winfield Scott proposed what would become known as the Anaconda Plan, a strategy not of dramatic invasions, but of slow strangulation. Blockade southern ports, cutting off their cotton exports and imports of war materials, seize control of the Mississippi River, dividing the Confederacy in two, then squeeze, slowly, patiently, until the South collapsed from economic exhaustion. Critics mocked it, newspapers ridiculed it, politicians dismissed it. They called it too slow, too cautious, too defensive. The public wanted action. They wanted armies marching, battles fought, the rebellion crushed. On to Richmond, the newspapers demanded. The Confederate capital was only 100 miles from Washington. One great battle, one decisive victory, and the war would be over. But Scott understood something others did not, that wars are won through strategy, not just battles, that the Confederacy's greatest vulnerability was its economy, its dependence on cotton exports, its lack of manufacturing, its vulnerability to naval blockade. Although ignored at first, ridiculed as the plan of a senile old man, the Anaconda Plan would later prove prophetic. The Union blockade would eventually strangle Southern trade. The capture of the Mississippi would divide the Confederacy and cut Texas and Arkansas off from the rest of the South, and the slow squeeze would eventually force the South to its knees. But in the summer of 1861, no one had the patience to wait. They wanted war now. They wanted glory now. They wanted victory now. And so the Union Army marched. The North crossed the Potomac and marched toward its first disaster. Union troops advanced into Virginia in the early summer of 1861, flags waving, drums beating, bands playing. 35,000 men, the largest army ever assembled in North America, marching south to crush the rebellion. They were volunteers, farmers and clerks, shopkeepers and laborers. Most had never fired a gun in anger. Their training consisted of a few weeks of drill. Their officers were political appointees, lawyers and businessmen who had read military manuals but never led men in combat. They marched slowly, stopped frequently, struggled with the heat and the weight of their equipment. Some fell out, some deserted, some simply sat down by the roadside and refused to go on. Poor reconnaissance, confused leadership, and inexperienced soldiers led them straight into defeat at the Battle of Big Bethel on June 10th. It was a small engagement, barely worth calling a battle. But it set an ominous tone. The Union forces, approaching what they thought was a small Confederate outpost, instead ran into a well-prepared defensive position. In the confusion, one Union regiment fired on another, causing casualties before the real enemy was even engaged. The attack was disorganized, the retreat was panicked, and the Confederates, fighting on their own soil with local knowledge and better leadership, won easily. Big Bethel was just the beginning, a warning of disasters yet to come. But the North was not listening. The newspapers barely mentioned the defeat. The public still demanded action, and Lincoln, under enormous political pressure, ordered the army to advance. Not all of Virginia would fight for the Confederacy. West Virginia was born in the chaos of rebellion. When Virginia seceded from the Union in April 1861, the western counties refused to follow. The mountainous region west of the Alleghenies had little in common with the plantation society of eastern Virginia. Few owned slaves. Their economy was based on small farms, timbering, salt production. They had more in common with Pennsylvania and Ohio than with Richmond. Union-leaning mountaineers rejected the Confederacy, held their own conventions, and declared that since Virginia had illegally seceded from the Union, they were seceding from Virginia. It was a rebellion within a rebellion, a fracture within a fracture. In June 1863, after 2 years of complicated political and military maneuvering, West Virginia was admitted to the Union as the 35th state, the only state formed by seceding from a Confederate state. The creation of West Virginia reshaped the political map and gave the Union fresh strategic ground in the mountains. It secured vital railroad lines. It protected the Ohio River border. And it provided a base for Union operations in the Appalachian region. But it also revealed a deeper truth, that the war was not simply North versus South. It was neighbor against neighbor, community against community. Even within the Confederacy, loyalty was fractured. Unionist guerrillas fought Confederate militias. Families were torn apart. Violence erupted not just on battlefields, but in mountain hollows and small towns. The dream of Southern unity was already cracking. But in the summer of 1861, most people still believed the war would be short, that one battle would settle everything. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Cheering civilians followed the Union Army, expecting a quick win. As General Irvin McDowell marched 35,000 Northern volunteers toward Manassas, Virginia in mid-July, an astonishing thing happened. Civilians followed. From Washington, from nearby towns, they came in carriages and on horseback. Politicians, reporters, curiosity seekers, society ladies in fine dresses, gentlemen with opera glasses. They brought picnic baskets, champagne, blankets to sit on while they watched the battle. They believed they would witness a short and glorious victory, a grand show of Union strength. The rebels would flee, the war would end, and they would go home with stories to tell their grandchildren. Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio came, Senator Lyman Trumbull of Illinois, congressmen, Treasury officials, even some foreign diplomats. They positioned themselves on hills overlooking the expected battlefield, set out their picnics, and waited for the show to begin. McDowell, mortified by the presence of civilians but unable to turn them back, continued his advance. His plan was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for Green troops, a flanking maneuver around the Confederate left, then a strike at their rear, cutting them off from Richmond. But the plan required speed, coordination, and experienced soldiers. McDowell had none of these. His army moved slowly. Some regiments stopped to pick blackberries. Others refused to march on Sunday for religious reasons. Officers got lost. Units went to the wrong places. And the Confederates, commanded by General P.G.T. Beauregard, were waiting. The battle began early on July 21st. Bull Run began with confusion and ended in catastrophe. McDowell's inexperienced troops attempted their complex flanking maneuver, but from the start, everything went wrong. Units got lost on unfamiliar roads. Officers gave contradictory orders. Regiments arrived late or in the wrong positions. The element of surprise was lost. The initial Union attacks made progress, pushing back Confederate forces, threatening to break their line. For a few hours, it looked like the North might win. The civilians on the hills cheered, but Confederate reinforcements were arriving by railroad. The first use of rail transport to move troops to a battle in American history. General Joseph Johnston's army from the Shenandoah Valley was rushing to Beauregard's aid. And on a hill called Henry House Hill, a Virginia brigade held firm. Stonewall Jackson earned his name in the fire of battle. as Union forces nearly broke the Confederate line, as Southern troops began to waver and fall back. General Barnard rallied his men by pointing toward Thomas J. Jackson's brigade standing firm under fire. "There stands Jackson like a stone wall," he shouted. "Rally behind the Virginians." A legend was born in that moment. Jackson, a former professor at Virginia Military Institute, eccentric, deeply religious, and utterly fearless in combat, had positioned his brigade on the reverse slope of the hill, protected from artillery, waiting. When the Union troops crested the hill, Jackson's men rose and fired a devastating volley. The attack stalled. Then, reinforced by fresh Confederate troops, Jackson counterattacked. From that day forward, he was known as Stonewall Jackson, and his name would become synonymous with Southern defiance, audacity, and military genius. He would win victories that seemed impossible, march his men faster and farther than anyone thought possible, strike where he was not expected, and disappear before the enemy could respond. But legends died too, and Jackson's fate would be as tragic as it was heroic. At Bull Run, his stand allowed the Confederates to turn the tide. And then, the Confederates charged. The rebel yell broke the Union line and broke their confidence. When Confederate troops charged screaming across Henry House Hill, they unleashed something that would become one of the most terrifying aspects of Civil War combat: the rebel yell. A high-pitched, wild, blood-curdling scream. Part war cry, part hunting call, a sound meant to intimidate and demoralize. And it worked. The panicked Union soldiers, already exhausted and confused, already demoralized by the failure of their attacks, broke and ran. What had been an orderly retreat became a rout. Officers lost control. Soldiers threw down their weapons. Entire regiments disintegrated. The road back to Washington became clogged with fleeing troops, abandoned wagons, discarded equipment. And the civilians, the politicians and society ladies who had come to watch a glorious victory, found themselves caught in the panic. Their carriages blocked the road, their horses spooked. They scrambled to escape, some abandoning their vehicles and running on foot. The retreat devolved into chaos, a nightmare of panic and humiliation, men drowning their fear in looted whiskey, officers unable to stop the flood, a complete collapse of military discipline. The Union had lost its first major battle, and the loss was devastating not just militarily but psychologically. The newspapers that had been screaming, "On to Richmond!" fell silent. The politicians who had demanded immediate action suddenly had nothing to say. And Lincoln, sitting in the White House receiving telegrams about the disaster, realized the war would not be short. The Confederacy, meanwhile, celebrated. They had proven they could fight. They had defeated a larger Union army. They had protected Richmond. The South believed victory was within reach, that the North would lose heart, that foreign powers would recognize Confederate independence. But the victory at Bull Run, later called First Manassas by the South, was also a missed opportunity. The Confederate Army was too disorganized to pursue, too exhausted to follow up their victory with an attack on Washington. And the North, shocked and humiliated, would not make the same mistakes again. Lincoln began searching for new generals. The army would be reorganized, retrained, expanded. And the war that both sides expected to end quickly had only just begun. The Union would have to learn to fight, or lose everything. And to maintain order, to prevent dissent from undermining the war effort, Lincoln would take extraordinary and controversial measures. Political pressure turned Lincoln into a wartime authoritarian. To protect the capital and maintain order, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, the constitutional right to challenge unlawful imprisonment. He authorized military arrests of civilians suspected of disloyalty. He censored mail, monitored telegraphs, shut down newspapers critical of the war effort. Federal marshals raided newspaper offices, seized printing presses, arrested editors. In Maryland, where Confederate sympathies ran strong and secession seemed possible, Lincoln ordered the arrest of state legislators to prevent them from voting on secession. These actions, while effective in preventing Maryland from seceding and keeping Washington secure, sparked national debate about presidential power in wartime. Was Lincoln a dictator, or a leader doing what was necessary to save the Union? His critics called him a tyrant, King Lincoln, a despot worse than any European monarch. They accused him of shredding the Constitution he had sworn to protect. His supporters called him a savior, a man willing to make hard choices, to do what was necessary even when it was unpopular. The truth lay somewhere in between. Lincoln believed the Constitution could not survive if the nation did not, that preserving the Union required extraordinary measures, that in a time of rebellion, some rights had to be temporarily suspended to save all rights permanently. Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted? He asked. And the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated? It was a dangerous gamble, one that would define his presidency and test the limits of American democracy. The arrests continued throughout the war. Even congressmen were arrested for criticizing the war. Clement Vallandigham, a vocal anti-war Democrat from Ohio, was one of the most prominent cases. A congressman, a leader of the Copperhead movement that opposed the war, Vallandigham gave speeches denouncing Lincoln, calling the war unconstitutional, demanding immediate peace negotiations. In May 1863, after losing his congressional seat, Vallandigham addressed a rally in Ohio. He called Lincoln a tyrant, called the war a failure, urged resistance to the draft. General Ambrose Burnside, commanding the Department of the Ohio, ordered his arrest. Soldiers seized Vallandigham from his home in the middle of the night. He was tried by military commission, found guilty of expressing sympathy for the enemy, and sentenced to imprisonment. The arrest became a lightning rod for controversy. Was this justice or tyranny? Vallandigham's supporters called it an outrage, an attack on free speech, a sign that Lincoln had become a dictator. Lincoln's defenders argued that dissent during wartime gave aid and comfort to the enemy, that Vallandigham was undermining the war effort and encouraging desertion. Lincoln, trying to defuse the controversy, commuted the sentence, but rather than releasing Vallandigham, he exiled him to the Confederacy. It was a bizarre punishment. Vallandigham was escorted through Union lines and handed over to Confederate pickets. The Confederates, not knowing what to do with him, eventually helped him reach Canada. From Canada, Vallandigham continued his campaign against Lincoln, eventually sneaking back into Ohio in 1864 to campaign for the Democratic presidential candidate. Lincoln, having learned his lesson, ignored him. The debate over civil liberties during wartime raged throughout the conflict, and the questions raised about executive power, about the balance between security and liberty, remain relevant today. While Lincoln grappled with political opposition at home, he faced an even more frustrating problem with his military leadership. Lincoln's generals weren't just slow, they were outdated. Many senior Union commanders were old Mexican War veterans unprepared for modern warfare. They had learned tactics in the 1840s, when battles were fought in neat lines, when cavalry charges could still win battles, when a general could see his entire army from a single hilltop. But the Civil War was different. Rifled muskets had replaced smoothbore weapons, increasing effective range from 100 yards to 500. Artillery had improved dramatically. The telegraph allowed near-instantaneous communication. Railroads could move armies hundreds of miles in days. This was modern warfare, industrial warfare, and many Union generals did not understand it. General George McClellan, who took command after Bull Run, was brilliant at organizing and training armies. His men loved him. He transformed the demoralized mob that fled from Bull Run into the disciplined Army of the Potomac. But he was terrified of casualties, convinced he was always outnumbered, reluctant to attack. He would drill his army endlessly, write brilliant plans, then hesitate, delay, find excuses not to fight. Lincoln grew increasingly frustrated. "If General McClellan does not want to use the army," he said, "I would like to borrow it for a time." Other generals were simply incompetent. Burnside would lead the army to disaster at Fredericksburg. Hooker would be outmaneuvered at Chancellorsville. Pope would lose badly at Second Bull Run. The South, meanwhile, had commanders who understood that this war was different, that the Confederacy could not win a long war of attrition, that they had to be aggressive, had to take risks, had to win decisive victories before Northern resources overwhelmed them. Until the Union found its own aggressive leaders, it would continue to lose. But while the military struggled, a quiet revolution was beginning. Slaves became contraband, and a pathway to freedom began. In May 1861, 3 enslaved men escaped from a Confederate fort in Virginia and sought refuge at Fort Monroe, a Union stronghold. Their owner, a Confederate colonel, demanded their return under the Fugitive Slave Act. But General Benjamin Butler, commanding Fort Monroe, refused. He declared them contraband of war, property seized from the enemy. It was a legal loophole, a clever way to undermine slavery without directly challenging it. But it became a lifeline. News spread through the slave community, hundreds. Then thousands of enslaved people fled to Union lines, seeking protection, seeking freedom. The Union didn't know what to do with them at first. Some officers returned them to slavery, others put them to work, still others declared them free. In August 1861, Congress passed the first Confiscation Act, authorizing the seizure of property used to support the rebellion, including enslaved people. It was a military measure, not a humanitarian one, at least officially. But it transformed the war. Thousands of enslaved people fled to Union lines. They worked as laborers, cooks, teamsters, hospital workers. They built fortifications, loaded supplies, tended the wounded. They served as scouts, providing invaluable intelligence about Confederate positions, troop movements, terrain. Some spied on the Confederacy, risking torture and death to gather information. The Confiscation Act transformed the war's moral landscape long before the Emancipation Proclamation. It proved that slavery and the war were inseparable, that the conflict was not just about preserving the Union, but about human freedom. The path to emancipation had begun, and there would be no turning back. As the Union struggled to find its footing in the East, war erupted across the entire nation. The West erupted in violence at Wilson's Creek. Missouri, a border state that remained in the Union, became a battleground. The state was deeply divided. Southern sympathizers formed militias. Union supporters organized home guards. Violence erupted in cities and on farms. In August 1861, Brigadier General Nathaniel Lyon, commanding Union forces in Missouri, launched a daring surprise attack against a larger Confederate army at Wilson's Creek near Springfield. Lyon's force of 5,400 men attacked 10,000 Confederates. The battle raged for hours, brutal and bloody. Fighting in the August heat, dense smoke from black powder obscuring the battlefield, men falling by the hundreds. Lyon, riding at the front of his troops, inspiring them with his fearlessness, was killed leading a charge. With their commander dead, the Union forces retreated. It was another Southern victory. But it came at a cost, over 1,300 Confederate casualties. Missouri would remain contested. The state became a nightmare of guerrilla warfare. Union and Confederate militias, bushwhackers and jayhawkers, Neighbor turned against neighbor, farms burned, families murdered. The war in the West was just as savage as in the East, and Wilson's Creek proved it. While armies clashed on land, the Union Navy began implementing Scott's Anaconda Plan. The South nearly lost everything through a naval oversight. The Confederacy had focused its defensive preparations on land, building forts to protect Richmond, training armies, organizing militias. But they had largely ignored their coastline. The result was disaster. In late August 1861, a Union fleet of 7 warships attacked Forts Hatteras and Clark. Poorly constructed Confederate fortifications at Hatteras Inlet on North Carolina's Outer Banks. The Union warships bombarded the forts from offshore, beyond the range of Confederate guns. Within 2 days, both forts surrendered. It was a small victory, barely noticed by Northern newspapers focused on the disaster at Bull Run. But it revealed a fatal weakness. The South had over 3,000 miles of coastline, dozens of ports and inlets, and inadequate defenses. The Union Navy now had a base, a launching point for future operations, a foothold on the Confederate coast. The Anaconda Plan was beginning to work. The blockade tightened, Union ships patrolling the coast, seizing Confederate vessels, cutting off trade with Europe. Southern cotton, the Confederacy's main export and source of revenue, piled up in warehouses, unable to reach foreign markets. The South's economy began to suffer. Shortages developed, prices rose. The Confederacy struggled to import weapons, medicine, manufactured goods. One oversight, inadequate coastal defenses, and the South's future began to crumble. But in the Western theater, the Confederacy won another victory. Lexington fell after 9 hours of relentless bombardment. In September 1861, General Sterling Price besieged Lexington, Missouri. A Union garrison of 3,600 men held the town. Price had over 18,000 troops, but the Union held strong defensive positions. Price needed to get close to bring his artillery within effective range, but crossing open ground would be suicide. So he improvised. His men soaked hemp bales in the Missouri River, making them too wet to catch fire from artillery. Then, they rolled the bales forward, using them as mobile shields, advancing slowly, methodically, toward the Union positions. It was brilliant, creative. Exactly the kind of tactical innovation that would characterize the entire war. The Union defenders fought bravely, but they were surrounded, outnumbered, running low on water in the September heat. After 9 hours of relentless bombardment, they surrendered. The South celebrated Lexington as another proof of Confederate military superiority. But victories in Missouri meant little in the larger war. The Confederacy was winning battles, but the Union was learning, adapting, preparing for a longer fight. The South celebrated Lexington, but the North was already planning its revenge. And in Virginia, disaster struck again. Disaster struck again at Ball's Bluff. In October 1861, Union forces attempted a reconnaissance in force across the Potomac River near Leesburg, Virginia. The operation was poorly planned, based on faulty intelligence. Poor reconnaissance led Union forces into a trap along the Potomac. They climbed the steep bluffs of Ball's Bluff, only to find themselves surrounded and outnumbered. The Confederates attacked, and the Union line collapsed. Men tumbled down the cliffs trying to escape. Some drowned in the river. Others were shot as they tried to swim. Colonel Edward Baker, a close friend of Lincoln and a sitting U.S. Senator, was killed in the chaos. Bodies floated down the Potomac, washing up near Washington, a grim and continued reminder of the war's cost. Lincoln was devastated. He had lost a friend, suffered another humiliating defeat, and faced growing doubts about whether the Union could win this war. The loss of Baker, whom Lincoln had known since his days in Illinois, was personal. Lincoln had named his second son, Edward Baker Lincoln, after him. Ball's Bluff was another reminder that the Union was losing, that its generals were making terrible mistakes, that good men were dying for those mistakes. Congress, outraged, established the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. Politicians began investigating generals, second-guessing military decisions, interfering in strategy. It would complicate Lincoln's efforts to find effective leadership. But after Ball's Bluff, the public demanded accountability. The Union seemed to be stumbling from one disaster to another. And then, the war nearly became something much larger. Britain nearly entered the war over a single ship. On November 8, 1861, Captain Charles Wilkes of the USS San Jacinto stopped the British mail ship Trent in international waters. Confederate diplomats James Mason and John Slidell, traveling to Europe to seek recognition and support for the Confederacy, were on board. Wilkes boarded the British ship, seized the two diplomats, and took them as prisoners. The North celebrated. Wilkes was hailed as a hero. Congress gave him a gold medal. But Britain was outraged. The British government considered it an act of war, a violation of international law, an insult to British sovereignty. Britain prepared for war, mobilized troops, sent reinforcements to Canada. The British press demanded action. The government issued an ultimatum: release the prisoners and apologize, or face the consequences. The Confederacy hoped desperately that Britain would intervene, that the world's greatest naval power would break the Union blockade and recognize Southern independence. Lincoln faced an impossible choice: release the prisoners and look weak, admit that Wilkes had acted wrongly, suffer the political consequences, or keep them and fight Britain, while already fighting the Confederacy. A two-front war the Union could not possibly win. Lincoln's cabinet debated. Some wanted to stand firm, others urged caution. Secretary of State William Seward, recognizing the danger, crafted a careful response. The prisoners would be released, but not as an apology. The United States would claim it was simply upholding the principle it had always advocated: the rights of neutral ships. It was diplomatic genius, a way to back down without appearing to back down. On January 1, 1862, Mason and Slidell were released to British custody. Britain stayed neutral, and the Confederacy lost its best chance for foreign recognition. One ship, two men, and the fate of the war had hung in the balance. As 1861 ended, the war had become a stalemate. The Confederacy had won most of the battles, but held no illusions about ultimate victory. They needed foreign recognition. They needed the North to lose heart. They needed something to break the deadlock. The Union had suffered repeated defeats, but Lincoln was determined. He was reorganizing the army, finding new generals, preparing for a longer war. Neither side understood that 1862 would bring even greater bloodshed, greater victories, greater losses, and battles that would change everything. The nation had divided, the armies had formed, the first blood had been shed. But the real war, the brutal, grinding, devastating conflict that would reshape America, was only just beginning. End of Episode 1.